Hello. So thanks for your patience, folks. Doug, I think we're going to go ahead and open up the meeting. And if our guest speaker doesn't find herself in the meeting for whatever reason, we will invite still Matthias to offer a welcome to the 3 days that are about to start. We might invite Jing to come here and say a few words and be in conversation with Matthias for a bit. All right, here we are. Folks are coming in now to the Zoom meeting. So I'll just wait a second till everybody's comfortable. Hi, everyone. Welcome in. Take your time to settle in. Perhaps I'll just say a few words of welcome before passing the floor here to Matthias Fritsch, who joins me here today in fourth space. So do feel free to keep on your camera, as some of you have done, your video. We welcome seeing you in the space if you're participating via Zoom. And of course, those of you who are here with us, thanks again for bundling up with us. I know it's cold in here. So good afternoon and welcome to Indigenous World View, Intergenerational Ethics and Heritage. Today featuring our guest speaker, Mona Polaka, who I believe we are still waiting for, hence the little delay. So thanks so much for your patience. And if you are there in the audience, please do let us know once you've joined. This is the opening talk for Justice Between Generations, Asian, African, Indigenous, and Western Perspectives, which is this 3-day conference that will be engaging with intergenerational ethics through cross-cultural philosophical dialogue beginning tomorrow, so Wednesday, September 29th, running until October 1st. It has been a pleasure, if I may just add this, for us here, the team at Fourth Space, to work with the team working on this conference, the faculty members and researchers, students in philosophy here at Concordia, helping to make these events happen, or working very hard for, I believe, probably 2 years to make these events happen. For those of you who are joining us at Fourth Space for the first time, either here in front of me or on Zoom, welcome. We're so glad you could join us. We are part of Concordia University. We are located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. And what we do is facilitate daily experiences and activities that allow for any measure of knowledge sharing. So really, we're focusing on what the Concordia community members are working on in terms of research initiatives and course activities. And we try to activate those doings in the space. So as you've already noticed, we are running this event as a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar, meaning that you are very much encouraged to turn your cameras on and participate in the discussion via the chat, obviously, if you're more of a texter, but we also invite you to raise your hand and speak if you are comfortable doing so by turning your camera on or just your audio. And for those of you joining us here in the space, again, we will set up a little microphone for you here so that folks on Zoom can see you and hear you if you have questions or comments that you'd like to make today. Did I have any other things to say? I did. I do want to tell you that we are live streaming onto Facebook and that we are recording this event, and I'll pop those links into the chat for those of you joining us on Zoom. And finally, it is my pleasure now to pass the floor to Concordia philosophy professor Matthias Fritsch. Hi, Matthias. Over to you.
Hi, Anna. Thank you very much for this wonderful way of getting us started. I think we're still waiting for Grandmother Polaka. So Grandmother Polaka, if you are among us, please make yourself known because we would like to know and we would like to welcome you here. In the meantime, while we're waiting for her to join us, I will say a few things by way of introduction to today's event, which we're still hoping will happen, as well as about the conference that will start tomorrow at 1 o'clock and will run until Friday afternoon. So bienvenue à Montréal, bienvenue à Concordia. My name is Matthias Fritsch, as Anna said. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here at Concordia. And this is meant to be the opening event for the conference Justice Between Generations that we would like to be as conversational as possible, an exchange of ideas organized by the intercultural comparative philosophical research network, Nature Time Responsibility, which has organized a number of events dedicated to intergenerational justice, but also dedicated to the philosophy of nature, as the title indicates. I wanted to begin by the land acknowledgement, the territorial acknowledgement, which I think is particularly important, and for this event. And I want to say why after I do it. I come originally from Germany. I have been at Concordia for almost 2 decades, not quite, but almost, so a long time. My first book that I published while at Concordia, in fact, dealt with historical violence and the role and place of the dead victims in political struggles in liberal democracies. In hindsight, I think my book could have done a more meaningful and better job of situating that discussion in the context of a settler state like Canada. And so that is why it is particularly important to me to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University, which is where we are right now here, from which we are Zooming and live streaming with a live audience, is situated on unceded Indigenous lands. So I recognize the Ganjongehaaga Nation as the custodians of the lands and waters from which I speak to you today. Tiohtià:ke is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples, including Canadian settlers. I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in Tiohtià:ke, in Quebec, and in Canada. So why is this territorial acknowledgement particularly important today? Well, first of all, this is the opening event for the conference that runs until Friday, including September. And as many of you here in Montreal, in Canada, will know, but perhaps not know if you come from elsewhere, is that Thursday, so one of the days of our conference, is now the first ever National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And that is a statutory federal holiday, not a provincial holiday. And the installation of such a national day for truth and reconciliation in Canada was recommended by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report from 2015. And it is only now that the federal government has reacted to this and instituted such a day. And this was actually, the decision was made in May, is my understanding. And that was actually after the dates for this conference had been set. And the federal government did this in response to the discovery of unmarked graves around residential schools, or former residential schools, that bespeak these and other atrocities that the Canadian government has perpetrated on Indigenous peoples in Canada. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that at the time, 4,100 named and unnamed students had died in residential schools across Canada, but more recent estimates put that figure closer to 25,000. These discoveries reignited the debates as to whether we should here speak just of cultural genocide, which is what the term that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had settled on, or in fact of plain genocide. So the federal government reacted to this by instituting this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which takes place on Thursday, and that day is also known as Orange Shirt Day. So please come and wear an orange shirt in remembrance of those children that were forcibly removed from their homes and from their families and from their cultures and traditional territories in order to be placed in residential schools, and also in remembrance of the children who never returned home. The generations of family members who are affected by this trauma, which is also an intergenerational trauma. So that is the first reason why I think the territorial acknowledgement is particularly significant for this event and for this week, and so today. The second reason why I think that territorial acknowledgement is particularly significant for this conference has to do with nature time responsibility and its promotion of an exchange of ideas. So we have understood ourselves in the 4 and 5 previous events that we have organized as a platform for intercultural dialogue of a philosophical nature concerning questions having to do with environmental responsibilities and intergenerational responsibilities. Because these are questions that shouldn't be addressed by just one culture, but should be addressed by various different traditions, and should be capable of being carried and supported by different traditions. And to achieve that and hopefully achieve a kind of overlapping consensus, a dialogue and conversation is needed among different traditions and different philosophical outlooks as to what nature is, what time is, and what responsibility means. So that was the fundamental idea behind the network, NTR, or Nature Time Responsibility, NTR for short. Now, but such an exchange of ideas in such a context, in this case involving also indigenous philosophies, could be seen as cultural appropriation or an extractivism of knowledge. In the context of where land is taken and people are removed from land, removed from families and so on, a mere exchange of ideas could suggest that we are discussing in a kind of open space where everyone has equal access and so on. Now that may be an ideal, but it is not a reality on the ground. So discussions take place among minds, but minds are embodied, and embodied minds need to live and be situated somewhere, and where they are situated, that will be a land that has a history, and that is the history that we're talking about here when we acknowledge the indigenous peoples of Canada, of Jojage, and so on. So that is another reason why I think the territorial acknowledgement is particularly significant in this context of NTR holding a conference in Montreal. Now, the third reason I wanted to give for why the territorial acknowledgement, in my view, is particularly significant for this conference is simply because of the importance of land and environment to intergenerational relationships. So I think it is no accident that many of the ways in which what we today, as the present generation, do affects future people passes through the environment. So especially long-term effects that we have today on future people are not exclusively, but or many of them are environmental effects, so effects by way of nature, and especially when it concerns planetary boundaries that are in danger of being overstepped. And so in a certain sense, then land and its history and its place from where it comes from, the ancestors that have cared for that land and so on, are particularly relevant to the topic of this conference, which is why the territorial acknowledgement is integral, is a very important aspect of the very topic of this conference. So it is in this context that I'm particularly pleased to welcome Grandmother Polaka, if she's with us. Is she? Do we have any word on this at this point? No, she's not yet with us. So I don't know what has deterred her and what's happening at this time. So maybe we can wait a little bit longer, and I hope there is a way that she will still be able to join us. Maybe I'll just do an introduction for Grandmother Polaka in the way that I had intended, and hope that in the meantime she will be able to join us. Becky, would you mind trying to call her? Because I can give you my phone. I have her number. Yeah. I've tried a few times, but please. Thank you. So, so the idea was that Grandmother Polaka would be joining us from Arizona. I hope it's not a problem of a time difference. Grandmother Polaka is a senior fellow at the Center for Earth Ethics, and I encourage you to look up the wonderful work that this center does. She is one of the 13 grandmothers of the International Council of Indigenous Grandmothers, and I'll say a little bit more about that. And she is a member of the Secretariat of the Indigenous World Forum on Water and Peace. Grandmother Polaka has held posts of responsibility within her own community, such as treasurer for her tribe, the Colorado River Indian tribe. She earned a master's in social work and has over 20 years of practical experience working, presenting, and publishing on health and social issues affecting Native American peoples. She is the founder, president, and faculty member of the Turtle Island Project, a nonprofit program dedicated to promoting a vision of wellness and providing transcultural training to individuals, families, and healthcare professionals. She is also an active member of the Healing the Border project of the Indigenous Alliance Without Borders. You see Grandmother Polaka is very active in her community and beyond. She is a founding member of the International Council of 13 Indigenous Grandmothers, which is an alliance of Indigenous women from around the world who are upholding, preserving, and protecting Indigenous practices and ceremonies, including the right to use earth-based medicines. Grandmother Polaka is a longtime active participant in the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples Issues, and has been invited to speak in global forums and assist in drafting several UN declarations. In 2008, Grandmother Polaka had the distinguished honor of being the representative of the Indigenous peoples on a panel of world religious leaders. These panelists drafted and signed a statement, Faith in Human Rights, in commemoration of the 60th year of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her efforts have included providing support to First Nations to build capacity in view of climate change, build sustainable communities, protect land and waters, and conserve biodiversity. And her talk today, as you will have seen, is entitled Indigenous World View, Intergenerational Ethics and Heritage. So any news on her presence with us, virtual presence? No. Yeah, so have I. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more about the conference and give us a little bit more time and see whether she will still join us. So Jing, would you mind joining me up here? And I think we have another mic. You want to grab the mic, I think, so that everybody can hear you well.
Hello. Thank you, Matthias.
You have to hold up the mic, I think.
Right.
While you're seated here, you can, take up the mic.
Okay. Well, thanks all for coming. And as we're waiting here, maybe I thought we could talk a little bit about how the conference came into its current shape. I know it has been two very unconventional years for all of us, and also the conference just one reflection of it. So we first came together, that was 2019, with this idea of holding a conference on nature time responsibility here at Concordia. And at the time, we were planning on to hold a conference entirely in person, right? So, and it went through a number of changes and revisions, and eventually we were really happy that we're able to have an audience here instead of having an entirely online event. So what I'm really excited about is that not only we are able to bring in speakers from all over the world, some of them will be here in person and some of them will be here via Zoom, but also that us, the local Montreal community and the local Concordia students and faculty members will be here, and we're going to be able to talk about all this really important issues from various philosophical traditions. So earlier today, we had a roundtable of a number of graduate students talking about Back to the Future. And we had a fruitful conversation. So I thought maybe we could use this time also to address some of the remaining questions that the audience might have towards either the conference itself, what Matthias had talked about earlier, or the earlier panel that happened this afternoon. So if you do have any questions or comments, do feel free to raise your hands.
I think one of the issues, if I could step in here, that came up was the openness towards the future. And there were questions as to when we think about what we today as the present generation owe future generations, to what extent we should be open and leave it up to the future to determine its own fate, as it were, and to what extent we have obligations of providing a framework within which future generations make their decisions. Those are tricky issues, of course. They always have to do with freedom and its boundaries, as it were. But usually we think of the boundaries that come into play when freedom interferes with the freedom of others, right? So that freedom is equal freedom. But sometimes I think in the context, especially of the environment and future generations, there are boundaries of a different sort that do not stem from respecting the equal freedom of others, but in this case, stem from what has been called planetary boundaries. So respecting planetary boundaries. And on some level, I wanted to offer to the discussion that we had before that it's one thing to say that what we owe future generations is freedom to make their own decisions. It's another thing to say that freedom has conditions, including respecting planetary boundaries, passing on a habitable biosphere, and so on. I would include in that passing on freedom protecting institutions. So it's also a political obligation, not just an environmental obligation. And so that thinking as to openness towards the future takes the form of, on the one hand, respecting autonomy and freedom. On the other hand, however, thinking about what the conditions of those freedoms are.
Great.
So this is what I wanted to offer to this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think earlier when I got here, I think a student asked me, Zechen asked me that, has there been extensive discussion of intergenerational justice or future generations in Chinese or Confucian philosophy? And I thought about it. A lot of times there definitely were, right? A lot of times they're talking about the sage king, 3 sage kings, Yao and Shun and Yu. And a lot of times Confucius mentions they refer back to the ancient sage kings as the moral exemplars. So they did talk about intergenerational ethics, but they were not talking about future generation. They were talking about the past generations, right? So it seems that it's very clear that they do recognize and acknowledge that there were intergenerational traditions and intergenerational reactions, right, from the past to the current. And all the people Mencius, right? To Mencius, Confucius was the past generation, and he was the future generation to Confucius. And for Confucius, he was the future generation to the ancient sage kings, right? So I think in there is a recognition that since we do take some of the past sages as moral exemplars, since their ethical behavior and virtuous behavior would have an influence generations later, we also, by the same logic, understand that our behavior would influence the future generation down the line in a similar way, right? So I think there is this logic of intergenerational, if not justice, then at least some kind of virtuous, caring tradition that goes on, that flows downwards into the future. So I think maybe perhaps in addition to a more atomic-based and right-based theory, there are also other resources to look into the future and think about the past, look into the future, realizing that our roles also switch, right? At one point, we were the future generation, right? To say that Confucius never thought about there's going to be a future generation, that is obviously not true. At his time, he definitely thought there's going to be a future generation, right? And at one point, we were the future generations, and now we are the current generation. But in the future, we're going to be the past generation, right? So I think there is also the taking turn, as Matthias would emphasize later, and also the switching of roles as in our thinking that might give us some insight that's a little beyond the framework of individual rights and justice.
Thank you, Jing. I think that is a wonderful introduction to Confucian philosophy and its bearings on the question of this conference. What do we owe future people and why? And I thought one of the things we could do while we're still hoping that Grandmother Polaka will join us is that we'll talk a little bit about the talks that will happen tomorrow and that will really happen. And so the first talk tomorrow at 1:15, in fact, the conference starts at 1 because we'll say some opening remarks, Jing and I, tomorrow at 1 o'clock. But at 1:15, we have, in fact, a talk by Marian Urdekun on Confucianism and intergenerational ethics. And to make all of you really, to whet your appetites and make you really interested in attending this event, I wanted to read her abstract. So this is one of the ways I think that we can provide a bridge from our discussion here today to the conference starting tomorrow. So Professor Urdekun writes, in this talk, the talk is called Confucianism and Intergenerational Ethics. In this talk, I explain how early Confucianism can ground a distinctly relational perspective on intergenerational ethics. The Analects of Confucius foregrounds intergenerational relations by rooting ethics in relationships between parents and children, and by presenting ancient sage kings as moral exemplars. You also mentioned them just a moment ago. From a Confucian point of view, persons are understood as persons in relation, embedded in networks of connection across space and time. Self-cultivation thus involves taking one's place in a community where one's own identity and welfare are deeply bound to those of others. In this view, gratitude and reciprocity emerge as central values. A Confucian understanding of gratitude and reciprocity involves not only dyadic relations, but broader connections within a temporally extended social web. Thus, Confucian reciprocity might involve honoring one's parents by nurturing one's own children in turn, or expressing gratitude for what past generations have provided by ensuring that future generations can flourish. Genuine ethical relations between current and future generations reflect care and concern for ongoing human communities, for the triad of heaven, earth, and humanity, and for realization of the Tao in the world. So this is our talk tomorrow, the first talk that will open the conference tomorrow at 1:15. Sounds really interesting. You want to comment on that? You know this tradition, of course.
Oh, definitely. I think Marianne's talk might have been based on a paper that was co-authored between Marianne herself and then David Wong, who is my former advisor, PhD advisor. So I'd be really excited to see this different generations of students talking about intergenerational justice together. I'd be really interested to see that. And I to my knowledge, I think Marianne's going to be here. Hodehun is going to be here in person. So, yeah.
Yes. So, any comments at this point? Yeah. So we have a comment from the audience. Would you mind going over to the mic? Yeah.
Like a singer. I directly here or this? Okay. You hear, okay. So, just I talked before with the professor about this issue. And I think actually the Confucius theory and Heidegger's theory get the same emphasis about this issue. Because in Heidegger, he emphasizes the being, the time happening right now. This is very important to our past, or also for our future. And but I think in Confucius theory, maybe we'll talk about something about past, what our ancestors did, whether we should follow them. But I think this something bring them to see what is their responsibility to the future. What they should do for the future, for something happening right now, such as when I mentioned my father told me what should I do, it's something to emphasize my responsibility and my duty, what I should be doing right now. So I think the Heidegger and Confucius pay more attention on the present time, what we should be doing today. So such as maybe when we mention something about maybe the climate change, some very big issue problem, we always say we should educate our children, something will happening in the future if we are doing so. But we never thought like something surely maybe limited ourselves to do something in our future, to change the climate change. It's something happening today, the political power, the conflicts between the countries and nations. This is something to limit our working today. So I think we should pay more attention on something we are doing today, such as how to solve the issues between the countries, so how to solve the problem between the different maybe they have the benefits from the pollution or something. So this is my idea. So yeah, maybe not very clear,
Yes.
but
Thank you so much for offering your thoughts. There's a lot to respond to, but I do think that in the work of Heidegger, you find resources for not thinking of the present as just the present, but as in some sense referencing the past as well as the future. So there's a long philosophical discussion of time that does not simply end up endorsing or presupposing linear time, a time where you have the past and then the present and then the future, but rather you have the present and the future implicated in the present in various forms and modalities that would have to be considered. And maybe in discussing an ethics of roles and the way in which relationships to ancestors, to parents, but also to children are central. Confucius gestures at something that would be amenable to this kind of a view of time. Not saying the same, but there's possibilities for a fruitful dialogue. And yes, action on climate change is, I think, urgently needed. I think we can agree on that. We could.
Yeah, I think we have
Go
a
ahead.
question from one of the audience via Zoom, Monica.
Oh, yeah.
Monica? Yeah. Feel free
Hello.
to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hello, everybody. Very interesting conversations. Thank you very much. I just learned like half an hour ago while I was in a class with Professor Janice Timbotos about this panel, and I signed in right away. Many thoughts on what have been said. This justice and this intergenerational encounters, I believe they're really important, and we've been trying to do so. But how I find it's difficult. It's easy to see how important they are, yet in the in the actual, in society right now, we have less spaces where these intergenerational encounters can happen. I remember when I was young, when I was a kid back in Mexico, there were like 4 generations living in the same house. So I remember my great-great-grandma living there and having these, and this was the norm. This was the like everybody lived like that. So you will have these intergenerational talks and these opportunities in your everyday life. In the society now, and here in Canada, how can we reimagine, how can we foster these spaces, and how can we foster new spaces where this can happen? So that would be something really interesting. It's not, of course, it's a question I don't have any answers, but I would like to be in more spaces where we talk about this, and where we can reimagine together how we can foster these spaces, but with the intention of these intergenerational meetings happening. That was a question.
Thank you. So I think hello. So thank you. I think that's very, very helpful, especially in pointing out that it's not only that in the future generations that we don't see yet, not born yet, it's also that in our society amongst different generations, we see a decrease of interreaction, and it becomes harder for us to understand different generations, and for us to spend time with our grandparents, parents, or the younger generation. So I think that's a very important insight, that having that sort of experience would enable us to understand, not just on an intellectual level, but understand the switching of roles, right? So it is when I am at an age of when my mother first had me, I realized, this is the you that I remember and I know. And before that age, I don't know what you were like as a child. Right? I can't imagine what my mother was like as a child. So I do think that it's very important for us to see that we do go through different time span in our own lives, but it's not just one trajectory and one life project. It's also shared. And if we do share that with different generations together, we have a better understanding and imagination of what it's like to take upon a different role. So I think that is indeed very important.
Yeah. Thank you, Monica, also for that comment. I think it's true that it's very important to think about the spaces in which conversations among generations happen, and then, in fact, that it's also, I think, very, very important to note that relations between generations are taking place all the time. And Jing earlier gave us the example of different generations of students. So generation doesn't necessarily have to mean biological relations. Even though the model of parents, grandparents, children, and so on is often used also in the theoretical literature. And I think that a tendency towards generations being spatially separated by not living under the same roof anymore is one issue. And the other issue that one could raise in this context is the question of the time in which, in fact, the generations that are overlapping can meet and encounter one another. And I think that our times are quite fast-paced, and that has a bearing on it as well. So the research has been done, empirical research, comparing different attitudes towards future generations in the countryside versus the city, which tends to be more fast-paced, life takes place at a more accelerated pace. And what we find in these studies is that attitudes towards the future are more willing to care for and make sacrifices for future generations in the countryside than in the city. So this is another variant here, countryside versus city. Interestingly, these studies were done both in highly industrialized countries and in countries a lot less industrialized, and the percentages that were found by the social scientists of pro-futural attitudes were the same, pretty much, roughly in the ballpark. So it's not a question of industrialized versus less industrialized. It's a question of countryside versus urban spaces, apparently. So this is another important factor to consider. So thank you for that, Monica.
Okay, so maybe we can move to the next question. So if not, anyone in the present audience have a question, I think is Joanna, or sorry, my eyesight is not very good. I can't see the name. So please feel free to unmute yourself and then tell us who you are and then what your question is. Mrs. Tatter.
Excuse me, sorry?
Yes, I thought you have a question.
Oh, no. I was just listening. Okay. Thank you. Not
okay.
Yet.
Okay, so I think Jason has a question. Yeah. And then please face the camera, which I think is over there.
Face the camera?
Yeah, I think it's over there to your left.
What a performance. Here?
Yep.
Yeah, so we started by Fritsch discussed how our duties towards future generations can be conceived as like a balancing between our autonomy and future generations' autonomy. And then we discussed how in Confucianism, perhaps we get the same logic by referring to the past. So one distinction I just wanted to draw out, it's interesting because in the first example, the future generations, their autonomy is like being weighed here. Whereas there's a sense in which with past people, their autonomy is not being weighed in this similar sense because they're already in the past. So their autonomy doesn't have the same force as perhaps the future generation's autonomy. Maybe you have more to say about that, but I just thought there was an interesting distinction to be made there.
Could you say a little bit more about what do you mean by their autonomy in the past weren't weighted?
Well, because like, why should we care about what, like, there's a sense in which because I have autonomy, I'm able to assess what happened in the past and value it based on my own autonomy. So like there's a sense in which I don't really have to care what people thought in the past, whereas in the future, to respect their autonomy, I have to care what they think about.
Right. So I think there are different ways to look at who we are and where we are, and then to construct our moral community, right? So one way is to think here, everyone that I see here is going to be my moral community, right? So one other way is to think everyone that had existed before me influenced me and influenced society to such a way that today that is, that I am a part of is a part of my moral community, right? So if we think about the moral community in a more social sense, then the people who have died in the past, but who have shaped our society, they're in some ways still kind of have a membership, right? They're not just gone, right? So if we take that framework, then they are kind of a part of our moral community. And so is the future generation, right? So if we have this gratitude, thinking and appreciation of how the past has changed the present, then I think naturally there is also the same line of thinking to say that, we are also passing this down to the future people. And then this, what we have now is not ours. It's not just, the ones that's here, right? It's not just ours. It's passed on to us from a previous generation. So I think in that, we get to consider, with that framework, we do get to consider the future people and then the past people, and we do consider their autonomy. Yeah.
So I totally agree with the moral community extending to the past as well as to the future. My point was just that there seems to be a way in which autonomy for past people weighs differently than autonomy for future people, because their options, their choices have like expired in a way. Of course, they live through us and we inherit a lot of them. And so there's some moral ties there. But it just seems like autonomy, like respecting the autonomy of past people seems to play out differently than respecting the autonomy of future people. That's all.
I think, just very short, I think maybe, I could be wrong, but maybe what you're pointing out here is that since the past has already happened and decided, it doesn't seem we have to respect their free choice or, autonomy, free choice in a sense, because it has already happened. It's no longer a free choice. It has already been chosen. Right? And then as the future generation and our current generation, we're still, we still have the free choice to choose. So I think that would be a more metaphysical question that you have to think about what free will and free choice would mean. And when we think about intergenerational justice, we may not have to subscribe to a specific framework, specific understanding of free choice. We could, but we also don't really have to. I don't know if that is, answers your question. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, suppose you were a really hard-nosed, what I call a presentist. So somebody who would say, well, the past is dead and gone, and the future, well, doesn't exist yet. So only what is in the present matters, including the autonomy of those who live now or presently living. Then, one of the first things one could say in response is that, well, our legal structures do respect the freedom or autonomous choices by and large of dead people, namely in the form of wills, right? You can write a will and it has legal standing. So even though the person who wrote it is no longer alive, right? Of course, it could be overridden in certain ways, but the autonomy and the choices of individuals living today could also be overridden in some way. So there's an indication that our legal structures too recognize those who are not presently living as having some legal standing. So you can have legal standing even though you're not alive. And I think that's significant when it comes to respecting past autonomy. Sorry.
So sorry to interrupt, but I have some exciting news that we are actually in touch with our speaker, but let's take a 5-minute break so our tech team can figure out and establish that connection, and then we'll be back for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Grandmother Polaka. It is so wonderful to see you.
I'm so sorry. I've been trying. I don't know how to. For some reason, my Zoom wasn't working.
Yeah, sometimes there are technical difficulties that it's not much we can do about, but thank you so much for being here with us now. It's really good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Would you mind just starting with your talk right away? Because we already did the introduction, we did the territorial acknowledgement, we had a little discussion about the conference that will continue tomorrow. Maybe you just want to jump right in the interest of time?
Sure.
It would
I'm
be
ready.
wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great. First of all, I'd like to greet each and every one of you. Gamu, in my mother's tribal language of the Havasupai. I'm grateful to be here today and acknowledge the land and the territory of the Indigenous people where I am, the Thanatam Nation, and as well as the Indigenous people whose lands and territories where I'm speaking to. And so I'm grateful to be here, and I really am grateful that I could have a little bit of time, and thank you to everyone who is joining. My talk today is on the Indigenous World View, Intergenerational Ethics and Heritage. And when we talk about our Indigenous people and our heritage, or the intergenerational practices that we continue to uphold, we always include our ancestry. And part of our ancestry includes the place where we come from. And so I want to go ahead and, as an example of that, present myself that way to you. I come from the Havasupai people of my mother, who are the people of the blue-green water from down at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And I'm from the Water Clan. And I was raised to believe that all of the water life, all things that come from the water, including myself and other human beings, we all come from water, from the water of our mother's womb. And so we call that our first foundation of life. And so part of that includes how do we ethically understand our relationship with water, and as well as the ethics that go along with how we care for it, how we take care of it, how we value it. And so so that's where I come from on my mother's side. And then on my father's side, I'm from the Hopi and Tewa people, Pueblo people of northern Arizona. And in that way, I come from the Sun Clan and Tobacco Clan. And so when you look at those two clans, that represents like the sun, we call it Dawa, our father, who watches over us every day and shows us the way through the light, and then create, is in unison or in harmony with Mother Earth, in that the father relates with the mother in caring and providing for all of life on Mother Earth. So so in that way, I call the sun my father, and rely on the sun like my father. And so I'm from the Sun Clan that way. And then I'm from the Tobacco Clan on my paternal grandfather's side. And as being from the Tobacco Clan, the tobacco, again, it goes back to how we relate to it. And in my relationship with the tobacco, you know, it's a relationship of respect for the sacred plant, and to have reverence for it, and to use it also in a reverent manner, and to you know, not to not be disrespectful to it when it's being used by others in a ceremonial way. And so in that way, I'm a member of the tobacco clan, and that's part of the plant life. And the plant life, it has roots into the Mother Earth, and so the Mother Earth, by providing this plant life, which also feeds the animal life, and which then also feeds us. It also, plant life could be our earth-based medicine that we've been given to take care of ourselves, our health needs, our physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional health needs. And so in that way, you know, we have, again, the ethical responsibility to look, you know, take care of them, and they take care of us. It's a relationship of reciprocity, of giving and taking. And so these are this is how I introduce myself. And then there's another part of the introduction, and that's if you meet Indigenous people, many times they're going to introduce themselves not only by their clan system, but also by their the water that they come from. And so for me, the water I come from is the Colorado River, which is here in Arizona. And so I was born and raised along the Colorado River. And the Colorado River also flows within the Grand Canyon. So that's my water, that's the water I come from. And so you might meet other Indigenous people who identify themselves by the water that they come from. It might be a river, it might be a lake, stream, it may be a part of where the ocean is, like the Pacific Northwest people, Indigenous people. They identify that they come from that part, that ocean. And then there's the Coast Salish people who also come from the coastal area of the Salish Sea. And so so we identify ourselves by the water that we live by. And so when it comes to that, you know, then we think about not only the ones that I'm giving to you as an example, but all over the world, there are Indigenous people that haven't separated themselves from the land, from the water, and all of nature. They haven't separated themselves from it. They continue to recognize it, value, and uphold honor and respect of these things that we say, that we know give us life, and never question it, and haven't even sought scientific evidence, Western scientific evidence that, you know, this is life. We have this understanding that has been passed down through the generations of, you know, how we were instructed to live on this earth, and how we were instructed that our survival depends on how we take care of her, what we give back to her besides receiving what she gives to us. And so with that, whenever we take anything from her, let's say, for instance, even the plant life, or from the gardens that many of our people have, there's an offering that's made before the seed is planted, during the planting, and while it's growing, and then when it's harvested. And so these are part of our instructions that we were given about how to live on this earth and to have this relationship and to value it, and to, like our ancestors did, they passed this knowledge on through the generations. And here today, there are still many Indigenous people who continue to, they have an unbroken chain that extends back to when our ancestors first came into this world. And so in that way, that those ways of living, ways of being in relationship to life on Mother Earth, as well as in relationship with one another, have been handed down and passed down through the generations. And the various ceremonies that are done also are passed down and have continuously been practiced. There are still Indigenous people who live that way. And it's like a continuum of being completely traditional to being a contemporary Indigenous person. And you can still find the completely traditional peoples in the world today. There are still Indigenous peoples in the world that have not, in some cases, we know that there are some Indigenous people, like in Amazonia, in Brazil, who have not had contact with the outside world. So we could say those are the people that live at the end of the continuum of being totally traditional. And at the other end of the spectrum is the contemporary people. The contemporary people are people who have, who live basically in the Western traditions, Western world, and have adopted Western ways of living and being. And so there's this continuum of our cultural orientation, our spiritual orientation, our social orientation. So, but I want to make sure that, the people who are on the other end of the spectrum, the Indigenous people who continue to live in their traditional ways, there are also Indigenous people who continue to live in their traditional ways, but are also exposed to Western culture and have adopted some of that Western culture. But there's still people who speak their language. They may still live within their traditional lands and territories, their communities, villages. They may still take part in the traditions of their people, the ceremonial traditions. They may also, at the same time, go outside of their traditional setting and their community and tribal community and and participate in Western ways of society. And along with that is our healthcare. That too is on the same continuum. There are traditional people who have never been exposed to Western medicine, and they continue to rely on their traditional teachings and the medicine, the plant life that they use for curing their health issues. And so there are those people that still continue to exist. And then on the other hand, there are also people who continue to practice the traditional medicine ways. They seek out a traditional indigenous medicine practitioner who they would go to get help for whatever their issues are. Maybe it's health, maybe it's mental, maybe it's psychological, or maybe it's social issues that are going on. But they seek out the assistance of a traditional medicine man, and then there are those that have become more acculturated into Western society, so they may have heard of it, but they've never been exposed to it. Then there are those moving further away from the traditional individual lifestyle. They would then be more contemporary. Maybe they know that they're native, but don't know what tribe they are or what nation they come from. They may not have any ties at all with their tribe. And then there are those who have been so acculturated that they don't identify themselves as indigenous or native or First Nations. They don't identify themselves in that way, in that manner. They're more of they identify more with their nationality, the nation that, American. They identify themselves that way rather than identifying themselves as being indigenous. And so, along that line, then all of these, the ways, the teachings that are on the traditional end of the spectrum are continuously challenged. There are many challenges in how we are able to retain and to continue to practice or live according to our traditional lifeways. And there are many influences that create that challenge. Like I said, as far as our medicine, traditional medicine is concerned, there are many factors that are affecting that. And much of it has to do with development. Much of it has to do with the ecological degradation that's occurring all over the world, that then either destroy or interfere with access to those areas where they find their medicine or even their food, their supply, the things that they use to perhaps even build their sacred ceremonial structures. Things like that are being affected and creates limitations and interference in the indigenous people being able to continue to protect and preserve these traditions. And so along that line, where it's our understanding that we call, and this term ethics, and we call it our original instructions about how to live in this world, how to have a relationship with all of the we say the divine creations, the water, the air, the fire, and the earth, all of these things that give us our everyday life, having a relationship with it in a humble and respectful manner. And these are some of the teachings that are passed down as the children are growing up. Various kinds of social boundaries that are set for the child. And in some tribes, they say by the time a child is 5 years old, they know everything there is to know about their identity, about their tribe, about who they are, and they know all about that already by the time they're 5 years old, because during their development, those important developmental years, they are being told, or they are being shown these ways. And I always hear other Indigenous people say, I'm a visual learner. And sharing up in an interview I did with some elders, one of the things they said was, we didn't have any kind of, instruction books or, like classroom type teaching. She said, our grandparents, our elders, our parents, they taught us by example. They showed us. Along with the talking, with the teaching, the oral history that was passed on, they would demonstrate it. They would, when in the seasons that they're supposed to do these things. So there's seasonal kinds of understanding, and again, we have those kind of ethics about the seasons and what we do during the seasons. Many of the tribes in the wintertime, that's the time when you can tell stories and stories of creation, and also stories about how, the animal life, the plant life, all of these other living beings to and how you do it, and when you worry what you do. I have my Havasupai late aunt, and whenever she told me and my siblings stories about our Havasupai people, when she finished, she would stand up and she would stretch out her legs and her arms and really stretch her body out. And she would say, Aniga, that's good. She would say that, and then we would get up and we would copy her, do that, because she told us that when you tell these stories, that there are certain energies that are awakened, and also when you're during the storytelling time, you're calm, you're relaxed, you're laying down, sitting there, so that she said, whenever you do that, whenever you're relaxed for a while before you get up, you're supposed to stretch. You stretch your legs, your arms out, you stretch your body, She said, like the, you know, like the cats or the animals do. When they're laying down, when they get up, the first thing they do is stretch. She said, that's what we're supposed to do. We watch the animals and follow them, follow their example in some, you know, in regard to how we care for our own body. And, uh, and so to do, when she told the story during the nighttime, when everybody is inside the home and they're, you know, everyone is present, to sit around the fire, to sit around, to gather together and to tell these stories, to listen so that they could learn. And they said that even if a child is sleeping while they're telling this story, that child is hearing the story and will understand about it. So there are these different through the plant medicine, how the offering that's made before you take it, and the prayer that's offered, and also it's telling the plant, you know,
Grandmother Polaka, can you hear me? Because we can no longer hear you, and we would like to suggest that you turn off your video to save bandwidth. In this way, if you just keep the audio, we have a better chance of hearing you. We lost her completely? Sorry to hear that. Let's just wait a moment and see whether she comes back. In the meantime, please prepare questions so that we can have a conversation should technology permit us to do that. Hello, Grandmother Polaka. Good to have you back with us. Can you hear me? Yeah. You are muted right now. We suggest you turn off video and use just audio. I apologize for these technical difficulties. Hello? Grandmother Polaka, can you hear me? I think you are still muted. Thank you, Anna. It looks like we lost her again, right? Yeah. Yeah, let's stretch like cats and dogs do when they wake up.
Seems like I've been talking 2 hours.
Hello. Hello, Grandmother Polaka. Just keep the video off and
Hello?
please continue. We can hear you now.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay, so I've been talking about our practices, our knowledge, our belief in relation to the teachings that have been passed down through our ancestors. And so now today, I like that that we're addressing the foundation of our ethics and heritage that come from our, our genetics and our with all people, and as well as the plants and the animals, everyday life. It's also it's an important consideration about how culture and social perspectives of our relationship with our place of origin have existed for millennia and are often overlooked when discussed peoples and territories. They have been gifted with certain special foods, certain special plant medicine, certain special ways of having their own economy established, and as well as their spiritual practices and beliefs, which are often or otherwise known as religion, and also the governing ways, the ways of having governance within a traditional society, traditional indigenous society, have their own ways of doing that, that are not that have not been part of mainstream society. Although there are some things about the indigenous peoples' ways of governing that were adopted here in the United States from the Haudenosaunee people in regard to the government and how there's the way there are certain responsibilities that are delegated or relegated to different people, and that's the same way with many of the indigenous societies have had their traditional chiefs. They come from a bloodline. It's based on their bloodline that they're called a traditional hereditary chief. And so that's how they get their chieftainship. And then, then there are the clan mothers, or the women who are also in that position of decision making, as well as upholding, order and maintaining the values and protocols of the community or the village. And so, and then also there are the seers, the people within the community that have been recognized as seers and having this gift of knowledge and wisdom, and to be able to have visions and be able to deliver messages to the people about things that are coming. And so and those are all part of the community and their culture. And the same thing with even the hunting or gathering, the practices that are involved in that, and how they do it and when they do it. All of these things is all part of like a cycle, the cycle of life. And so they understand these things, and part of the way that they live and practice this is that they can watch the signs or the changes in the season, and there are certain things that happen naturally within that season that they know what what they're supposed to do during that time, in preparation actually for the following season. Like now we're in the fall and winter's going to come, and so right now there's preparation for the winter season and preparing foods for the winter time, drying foods or drying meat, hunting for the game that whatever they eat. People of the fishing cultures are all doing their fishing and canning and drying their fish and getting it ready to have that for the winter time. And then their fruits and drying fruit or canning, preparing for the winter to have that. And so these are, again, all part of that, living in an ethical relationship with nature. And so today, we're overlooked in terms of the decisions that are made about, let's say, like the dams being built, the mega hydro dams that are being built, that once built, they change the whole ecosystem. And the indigenous people, they say, what happens is when they don't allow the river to flow, what happens is it changes the flow of the river. It changes the temperature of the water, so that the animal life that live there when they come to their spawning season, the temperature may be too warm for their eggs to survive, or even the hatchlings to survive once they've been born, and then there's not enough water for them. In certain seasons, the water goes down, and so there again it impacts the life of the other beings that depend on it. And so it's again, it relates again to the cycle of life. And then what also happens is when they do release the water from the dam, then the current is so strong that it washes the fish that are indigenous to that certain area of the river, or that live along that area, are washed away out of their own habitat. Or else, in the traditional way that these people fish, the way they fish, they may be the way they fish may be that they build these little rock corrals in the water, and they corral the fish into these little pools, and so that's how they catch their fish. Well, if there's a pulse that's released from the dam, what that does is it just destroys those little corrals, and then the current is so strong that access into the water is not possible by the indigenous people. So then their food sovereignty is imposed on. So they are, we are now wanting to be acknowledged and to participate in decisions that are made that affect the indigenous peoples, lands, and territories, and our lifeways. And it's an effort that's ongoing globally among indigenous people. More and more, we're seeing that there are these impacts are, creating so many disruptions in the natural state of the earth, and the things that are our survival, for for all of life on Earth, and that there are all of the things, devastating things that are occurring, with like the fires, the rivers that are drying up, and what we're seeing are, thousands of various animal species that are going extinct as a result of this, not to mention the impacts of climate change. And so, so these are some of our concerns, and it's pretty much our desire. It's our desire to, have voice in these decision makings, and to communicate our worldview with the people of the planet, which is, to me, this opportunity for me to, apologies for the disruption and complications with technology, but I'm really grateful that I could be able to lend my voice to, the efforts here today in regard to our, justice for our, through the generations. And it's, I feel like it's a really good time for us to be able to have this kind of dialogue, and I'm very appreciative of it. There are certain considerations that I like to mention in regard to the ethics and justice. There are considerations like what are the potential impacts to certain sensitive and critical habitat, like certain springs, hot springs, or freshwater springs, all these things that, what are the potential impacts for everything that is going to be done? And along that line is, a teaching of Indigenous people, and it's to consider what are, how is this going to affect or impact the future generations of our people? Our future generations, the ones that we will not see, we must consider them in these decisions and the actions that are being taken. What are the impacts that are related to our spiritual beliefs and practices? What are the impacts to the special status of various species, endangered species? What are the impacts to vegetation resources, native and invasive? What are the potential impacts to the groundwater in the area, the source and the volume of water needed by the encroaching industrialization of like mining, mega agriculture, mega dams, all these different mega projects have impacts on our water source. What is the impact to general life species, including the migratory birds and animals? And all this is very crucial to prevent impacts that can't be undone once they occur. And so that's what Indigenous people are thinking about, our ancestors, and especially the ones who made the treaties, signed treaties with the US government. They had expectations. They thought about us. We're their future generations that they didn't see. Now it's incumbent upon us to consider our future generations, the ones we will not see. We want them to have a life. We want them to be able to enjoy this beauty creation that we've been put on, and we are such a small part of it. We are a tiny, tiny part of this great creation, and we hardly know a thing about it. Our surface say it's our ancestors that are bringing it forward to show us, so that we could be able to wake up, we could be able to understand our sacred relationship with life on Mother Earth. I think that's all I have to say right now. I'm not sure if I've done a 2-hour talk, but I think that's about it for me now.
Thank you so much, Grandmother Polaka. Thank you. Would it be okay if we took some questions?
Sure.
Any questions here in the audience or over Zoom? If over Zoom, please put them in the chat and I will be happy to relay them to Grandmother Polaka. Jason, please step up to the mic. So we have a question here from the audience. Please go ahead, Jason.
Thank you for that great talk. So my question, when you talk about the teachings that your ancestors passed on to you, especially your ancestors like water and the sun, that rings a bell for me, that rings true for me. I'm very sympathetic to those views. But of course, it clashes with what you might call my ancestors and what they passed down to me as views. So for example, many people in Canada think that water is just H2O, just a bunch of atoms, for example. So what do you say to people who just like come from a completely different background to the point where they just don't even see these views of water being an ancestor as something reasonable? And like, how do you square that with such a different background and ancestry as like the Western ancestry or background? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I say to people like that, take 4 days off from your world, go up in the mountain and be up there without any water. Sit up there without water or food. If that don't teach you any understanding about your relationship and your dependency on fresh, clean drinking water, or to have even food, I don't know. But it's as simple as that. There's no big rocket science to this. It's simple. It's simple that they're basic foundations of life. We lived inside water in our mother's womb. When we came into the world, that water, it came out before us, we followed it. And ever since then, we've been depending on water to live. This air, when you were born, you opened your mouth and you took a breath of this air. It went into your lungs and filled it with this life-giving element. And you blew it out and you let out a cry, the sound of your voice. And ever since then, that's what you've been doing. You use this air to communicate. You use this air to breathe. From that time you came into this world. Every day from that time you were born, that one first time the sun saw you, you felt the heat, the warmth of the sun on you. That first time, we say that was the first time the sun looked at you and recognized that you were a special being here in this world on Mother Earth, and that he would take care of you, watch over you every day, never forsake you, never not be there for you. And that's the way it is. And then our Mother Earth, everything you eat, everything, I mean, I guess you can't say that about food substances now, but everything we eat comes from Mother Earth. The plants, the animals, like I said, they eat the plants, or the animals that eat the plants are eaten by other animals, but it's this cycle, and we live off of her. And so that's so basic. What is there not to understand about how important it is? Unless you do what I said, or else some of the elders, they say, turn their water off at their home. These are people who are, they don't know where their water comes from. They just think they can turn on a faucet and they get water. They have no idea where that water came from, what it went through to get there. No idea. But if they were to have to get a bucket and walk 6 miles to the nearest well to get their water, and when they get there, the well is dry, and they have to walk back home with an empty bucket.
Thank you. Thank you, Grandmother Polaka. We have another question here, Leah.
Hi, Grandmother. Thank you for speaking to us. You have this wonderful way of expressing your ideas so poetically. It's beautiful to listen to.
Thank you.
So I have a question. I'm wondering, and this sort of is building off of Jason's question, why should we think of water, of the earth, as a mother or as a parent? Why is it important that we know the names of the bodies of water that we live near, that we live off of? I mean, in Western cultures, we often think of water, we think of air as commons, as things that we sort of own as a collective, and or even sort of the property of the collective. Why is it important to think of water or the earth as being a kind of agent towards a person? Thank you.
Why? Why ask why? We called the water our mother because we were, we developed inside water in our mother's womb. That's why we call it our mother, Mother Water. And that based on that, all waters are sacred. They're our mother. That's based on a worldview of an indigenous experience. And yeah, I understand, this, I guess, way of thinking, water is a part of the commons, and it's supposed to belong to everybody. Then who is making decisions about how that water is being used and what's being put into it? Who's making those decisions? It's not the commons, right? So how can we even continue to believe in that concept that it's part of the commons when it's now being turned into a commodity? And the rights, which I believe the right to clean, safe drinking water is a human right, but that is very quickly going down the drain based on this concept of what you're talking about. And maybe, you know, it may not have any meaning to people who have, you know, who don't live, let's say, in the jungles, in the deserts. It may not have any meaning, you know, in relationship to your existence and continuation of life, because you're so accustomed to the convenience of, let's say, the commons, the public works, you know, that provide for you. But if you look around, more and more there is shortages of water occurring. I know down in Brazil, there's some days that they only have water 3 days a week. There's many places that are getting that way. In Arizona, we have a drought going on, and so there's you know, very strong demands on the water users to conserve water, or even to cut back on water. It's really I mean, these are my responses just based on my own lived experience. And so people who live in areas where they have the infrastructure to have water delivered to them directly into their home, usually aren't concerned. But I always say, know where your water is coming from. The people of New York, they depend on, you know, there's a watershed that they depend on for their water. They should know where that is, what it, you know, where is it? What is it called? What's happening to it? What's being done to it? How is it being maintained? Is there a projected time when the water level is going to go down, and there may not be enough water or water pressure that it's going to be delivered in New York City? You know, I say be aware. No, this is from a Hopi elder who told me this when I was about 14 years old. He told me that. Know your water. Know where your water is. Know where your clean water is. Take care of it. Know where you could find nice, clean, fresh air. Know where you can go ahead and go find, you know, the plants that you can eat, you can survive on. Basic survival actually is what it's called. The Hopi basic survival. And so and knowing how even to start a fire without a match, those kind of things, basic survival. And, you know, I guess in a way, you know, people who never thought they would be in this situation are being faced with these situations. You know, for instance, with the wildfires that have been going on, these uncontrollable, huge fires that are wiping out whole towns, and they're left with nothing. So we can't say it's something that's way over there or even way far in the future. It's happening now. And in a lot of cases, for a lot of people, it's when they least expect it and they're least prepared. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you know, that's just my response.
Thank you very much. We only have a few minutes left. Do we have more questions from the audience, Joël? Or, of course, also the Zoom audience? We want to close at 5:45 Montreal time, grandmother, and so we only have a few minutes left.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just have just a quick question. your talking about water really made me think of recently in Canada and Quebec, there was this first river that was that just gained like legal status, and this indigenous nation was, I think, is an Inuit indigenous nation, was named as the people that are to make the decision in the name of that
Yes.
river. So speaking for
Yes.
that river. Yeah. So
Good.
is there any other initiatives
Awesome.
like that in
Yes,
the States?
yes.
And what do
Well,
you think of those initiatives?
I love it. I think it's wonderful, and the Maori people of New Zealand, they successfully gained personhood for their sacred river called the Wanganui River, and that was back in 2017. And they have been given custody of the river. They are the custodians, caretakers, guardians of that river, to make, to be involved in any kinds of decisions making that's to be done about the use of that river, or any kind of proposals regarding the river. And they continue to do their traditional ceremonies. It took them 125 years to win this case, but they did it. Perseverance. Several other, like India, followed suit, following along with the Maori people on granting personhood to, I believe, 2 rivers there in India. There's been several other waters that have been given personhood. Now there's efforts to give personhood to various kinds of plant species to protect them. I think it's great. I'm very, very happy about those that movement. In the United Nations, and I can't remember the year, but there was a gathering of indigenous people in Bolivia, and they developed the what they call the Cochabamba Accord, which is a declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. And it was delivered to the United Nations Secretary General of by the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales. And this declaration has been sitting there at the United Nations now, maybe 10 years or so, I'm not sure exactly, but it's there. And this year, in the perhaps it's a COP26, the Convention of Parties, it's the Biodiversity Summit that they're having, but there is a call to call on the United Nations to adopt that Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth. So there's good progress being made.
Yes, there's also a movement underfoot in Quebec to give legal status to the St. Lawrence River. I think Jason is actually, Jason, who asked the question earlier, he is actually involved in that movement.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so that is a big river, of course.
Yes.
Speaking of the Maori, we had Krushil Watin here earlier. She had to leave, unfortunately. She is Maori, and she will give a talk tomorrow about intergenerational ethics from a Maori perspective.
Right.
So that is tomorrow. And I want to thank you, Grandmother Polaka. So
Welcome to Tohono Loss and Utilities Pay by.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. I wanted to thank you so much for your wonderful words today that I think we're all happy to receive and think about and let those words percolate throughout the rest of the conference tomorrow and the day after. So I'm happy that it worked out in the end, despite the connectivity issues we had at the beginning. And thank you so much for hanging in there and trying again until it finally worked for us. So I really want to thank you. I also want to thank the staff here at ForeSpace, Anna and Doug, and so everybody who was involved here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I hope, Grandmother Polaka, that we will see you again. And please feel free to join the conference tomorrow and the days thereafter. And we hope to hear from you again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And have a good conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.